Pamela, it's awesome to have you here. Why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself? I'm curious. If somebody were to ask you who you are, what would you tell them that the answer to that is?
I think I would say I am a curious individual who has had a really interesting and meaningful life. I have a great joy for the work that I do. And so I've been in business about 28 years. And my early roots were studying international development, really looking at grassroots development, liberation theology, social change. And that has really been a thread through a lot of the work that I've done, even as I moved into more traditional corporate training and development, and then later in 2005 into entrepreneurship and startup culture. Um, I've written a few books and really am an author practitioner. So I love working with my clients, who I call architects of liberatory change, who are people who are really building the tools for a more just and equitable world. And so for me, I get to use my own gifts to be supporting the growth of their IP, usually ideas expressed through intellectual property, models, methods, things that I really love. And
Hmm,
to do that in this moment for what the current offerings that I have on one side of my business, I'm a business coach and advisor. On the other side, I have an agency that builds licensing and certification programs. And
interesting.
then I'm sitting in a community lab, which is what my husband and I have had for the last 8 years, which is a space right in the middle of Main Street in downtown Mesa, where we, by day, do our work. My husband's a Navajo traditional healer. And then evenings and the weekends, we invite BIPOC community to do whatever it is that they want to do. So we've had thousands of people, all kinds of interesting events. And that's what I love the most, kind of being in the middle of community. And I'd
Ah,
say finally, I'm a mom, love my kiddos. I have a 37-year-old bonus son who's an artist in downtown Phoenix, freshman in college, Josh, who's 19, and then a 16-year-old Angie, who's a junior in high school.
right on. I love it. So let's get into the startup side of things. If you were to help somebody, let's say you walked in and somebody's got a startup, they're looking to build it, and you're consulting or you're helping them grow it, and you're bringing your models and your strategies to be able to do that. Where would we start? We can kind of walk through the process and just kind of see where it goes.
Yeah, I think the first set thing in entrepreneurship, and I think context depends a little bit. So historically, my first book was Escape from Cubicle Nation. So I work with a lot of people
Uh-huh.
that were in corporate jobs that already had pretty significant experience that wanted to leave and start a business. So we think about some of the pre-ideas. There can just be all of us walking around like, yo, I'd love to work for myself. It would be super cool. I'd love to not have to work for somebody else. But at first, it really is, I think, having self-awareness to realize, like, why do you want to be in business and what are your specific goals and objectives? It can drive the direction that you go for the kind of business that you create. So there are people who really want to leverage the experience they have to do something like consulting after they're leaving a long-term career. There are other people who are just looking to really have like the tools of the internet and AI, uh, create value of creating money in many ways for as little human effort as possible as a way to be creating money. And then there can be people who have big ideas about creating something new and architecting something significant, what I was describing before for my architects of liberatory change. So it could be everything from my client Heather Krause, who's a data scientist, creating a whole methodology to reduce bias and data equity, to my client Romy Mushtaq, who's the doctor who has a specific protocol and approach to like calming the busy brain. So with that, you can see it's not just becoming a consultant of what it is that you've done, it's really creating something new. So I think having an orientation to why you're in business is super important, because
Mhm.
then you can discern the voices, some of which are telling you, you have to be massively passionate about everything that you create. And I think that's important, where you're really in business because you care about what you create, versus I just want to have the most efficient way of making money as quickly as possible. Those are not my ideal clients, no shade at all. Like there's totally a market for that, and there are people who are really great at helping those folks. But to me, there needs to be a personal reason. And then you have to understand the market. You have to see the market fit. what actually is the dynamic in the market, how much of a connection do you have with customers, how much do you understand them,
Mm.
and then how quickly can you just get a prototype out there to be testing whatever it is, your product or your service, as quickly as possible, because all of us can have the greatest ideas in the world, but it means nothing until it just hits the market. So as quickly as possible, my suggestion is just start to experiment with things, see if somebody is willing to exchange money for a thing, even if it's less than it might eventually be. And then you start to really build the infrastructure around it, including marketing and
Mm.
operations and all of that kind of stuff. That's the early stage entrepreneur journey.
Right. Okay. So let's say we're in that phase and we can kind of walk through it. So if you're in the testing phase, how do you know what to start testing? Let's say that you've got a business and let's say you're profitable or you're pre-profit, maybe one or the other. And you've got something that you've got an idea of what you want to do for the clients. How do you know what to
Mm.
start testing so that you can have that optimized and be able to move on to the next stages?
You have to talk to them. You have to figure out, listen, and
The
figure out
client.
what are some of the biggest challenges that people have. The
Yeah.
easiest way to package something for sale is to listen to what people tell you that they need.
I love it.
And
Mm.
that is, it seems obvious, but it is amazing how few people actually take that approach. So it's generally, no, I have this great idea and I think
Yeah.
that it should be packaged in this particular way at this price point, and the market will just laugh at you. So
Kidding.
that's the
Yeah.
beautiful thing
Which is
about coming to the market.
Which is unfortunate. I mean, it is what it is, but people will spend years developing a product without asking a single person other than their mom and their best friend of what they think of it. If they think it's good, then it's good to go. And then they waste years and often hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I've seen it personally with people that are close to me in my life. My dad, for example, invented something, created after 2 years, molding,
Mhm.
design, everything. And then, yeah, it turns out the market had no idea what it was, didn't want it, and he didn't have the marketing prowess to be able to position it. So that happens all the time. And so when it comes down to having that communication with the client, how do you really get that communication started so that you can get the answers to know if they're interested, know what they would actually give money for, and then be able to start testing based on that. How do you see that whole process?
And first, I'd say I'm sorry for your dad. There's nothing more painful. It
Ah, it
really
is
is
what
like
it is.
making light of life. No, but it sucks. It sucks. There's
It does
nothing
suck.
worse than having
Yeah.
somebody lean into something, because it can be the greatest idea in the world. So all of us have been there
True.
at some time, and it's terrible because you feel like you know you have the answer, but people aren't willing to hear it. So um, but I think with that, you can see where factors start to like narrow in. And even when you're in early stage and where you haven't had a long career or you haven't done lots of things in consulting, a lot of it is where you just say, where's an area, I call it a watering hole, where
Hmm.
maybe great amounts of ideal clients might be hanging out. Could be a conference, could be a local event.
Love it.
And you have to know something about the skills that you have for, if it's a service business, if it's something like consulting, um, to be able to have a general understanding. Maybe you're really good with AI, maybe you're a great trainer, like whatever the thing is, you're good with HR or soft coding, whatever, that you can be in a place that would have people who are what you would consider ideal clients. And associations, another thing. And you can just walk around and have conversations and just be like, hey, nice to meet you. What's on your mind these days? Like, what's one of the biggest challenges that you have? And listen to what it is that they say. Again, the key is that you're talking to people who you might consider to be ideal clients. And that just means that they have a problem that you have a reasonable expectation that you can solve. And so in the early days, you're doing that work. It's often parallel with a lot. The way I got my start when I was a management consultant for 10 years in Silicon Valley. And then I did individual coaching of helping people leave corporate to start a business. So when I started to do the individual coaching, I had no reputation. I was not, of course, ethically going to go back to people who had paid me handsomely to help retain their employees and ask people to
Ah,
leave. So
interesting,
I
right?
really was
Yeah.
starting from scratch. I got married, changed my name from Stuart to Slim. So I was unknown
Huh.
completely on the internet. This is 2005. And so one thing that you can do to attract people is where you do start to share and write about it. In the old days, it was blogging. A lot of people have a newsletter or sometimes, build a YouTube channel. that's a way you can signal. I call it your beacon, where you can be sharing your own perspective, where people could find you because you're intelligent about the way you're sharing information. And again, it can be seeded by answering questions that ideal clients ask you. So there's this parallel track of knowing the general area where you're interested in working in, and then building an audience, kind of as quickly as you can. Often the easiest way to do it is by sharing expertise, being helpful in an area that you want to work in, and then just having conversations with people. I ask questions on social all the time. If you have, connections, ask people, ask people who might work with others that but it's the hardest thing in the world. And at the same time, it's the simplest thing to begin just to tune in. And the frequency, which is a mindset shift for a lot of people in early stage entrepreneurship, is you're not approaching the world saying, how can I convince you that you should hire me? You're saying, my most important job is to deeply listen to people who I think would be fun to work with, who have problems I think I can solve, and just listen to the language that they use when they describe what their problems are. And then to come back quickly with a prototype. I've done it in the early days where it's like, in the moment, they're like, yeah, I really am having a hard time with this marketing plan. I'm like, hey, how about we spend a couple hours working on a marketing plan? And then you figure it out. You set the time, you figure it out, you do the research to decide how you're going to design that session. And that's often the way it happens in the early days. I remember in Escape, I interviewed my friend Ramit Sethi, if you know him from I Will Teach You to Be Rich,
Yeah.
who now has huge platform and a book and a Netflix special and all kinds of things. He's done really well for himself, really smart guy. And early on, before he created I Will Teach You to Be Rich, him and his buddy had like 9 different startup ideas. And they basically were just going out to market and just testing to see what would work. And they ended up creating one particular thing. It was PB Wiki, I think. It was like way early 2000s or late 90s, where they just landed upon something people were interested in. And he said, real time, they just built it. They're like, hey, are you interested in this? And people said yes. They like created a Gmail address that was support, support for pbwiki at gmail.com. They started to build it real time. They began to get customers. And that's the way often when you're leaning in the early days, that you are really scrappy. And he said, every time something would break, they would fix it. They get an email like, this thing is broken, and right away they would begin to fix it. That's the uncomfortable part of how it is that you operate. And I think the other piece of that is, I don't come from the school of thought, which a lot of people do, that says, you're either cut out for entrepreneurship or you're not. I've seen many people of very different backgrounds be successful: introvert, extrovert, quick start versus studied. Like, there's not a particular description, but you have to be attuned to what the market needs. And if you are somebody who needs a little bit more structured preparation, it just means you need to be prepared for a longer ramp time. Nothing wrong with that. But like, don't quit your day job. I don't advise anybody quits their day job before they actually are generating real revenue with real clients as a side hustle.
It's hard, man. I mean, it's tricky when you talk about somebody having a job and going into entrepreneurship at the same time. And I see where you're coming from with a very practical viewpoint with it. What gets me is when they teach entrepreneurship in school, there's an actual class. I was shocked by this. Like, I'm a natural entrepreneur. I feel like a lot of people are, maybe not a lot of people, but the people that demographic and psychographic I deal with, it seems like it seems like there's a natural inclination to be either entrepreneurial or not. But you're saying that you can shift over from one to the other. I haven't seen that. It's been difficult for me to really observe that. Give me an example of when you've seen somebody be able to make that shift, and what were their character traits? What do you think was the reason for that success?
Oh, I mean, it was the first 10 years of my coaching business. So I work with so many different
Right.
people, from software engineers to, authors, speakers, consultants. I tend to be more in the service business side. I have not, that's been where I've done most of my advising, because that's my own experience. But it's a path that is different. Entrepreneur is not a magical identity. It's not in your genes. You can have certain behaviors, an attitude and orientation toward the world in terms of your communication style, or your Colby, which is the
Yeah.
kind of your MO. There's an index that measures like the way that you take action.
Yeah.
So
I
there
heard
can
you
be
say quick
certain.
start. So I was like, oh, quick Kobe. Okay. Okay.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, right? So there can be ways maybe that you're more naturally oriented toward risk, but
Yes.
being an entrepreneur, just like being a musician or a corporate employee or anything, is just a set of behaviors. Like you're choosing to be operating in a set environment according to specific goals and outcomes. You either are going to do the work or you are not. And I've seen, for example, people who might have more natural strengths and characteristics that would lead them toward entrepreneurship. So they're quick starts and they can take a high level of risk, but they may not have the discipline as somebody else
Right.
who's really willing to put in the structured habit, the day-to-day drips of things that you need to do. People who have a high tolerance for ambiguity, who have patience, who are not looking for instant results, are sometimes more effective in the long run where they're willing to look into it. And the other thing is, and I do have strong points of view just because I've seen a lot of pain and suffering. Let me tell you, when, like, I get what you're saying about not that it's hard when you're working full time to also have a side hustle like that. You cannot do it for an extended period of time, but it is so painful to watch somebody give up a
Yeah.
day job, have no
Oh,
money,
I
be
see. Okay.
brand new in entrepreneurship,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
expect that you can make what in some cases it's taken you decades of work to make a certain salary. It's, you just set yourself up for massive stress. For some people that kicks them into action, for other people it kicks them into total paralysis and financial ruin. And that's the part that makes me cranky, where there's an undiscerned, context less advice about entrepreneurship, like just go all in, burn the boats, all these metaphors. I'm like, according to whom? Do you have elderly parents that you're taking care of? Are you like an older sibling where you need to put your younger
I
siblings
love the
through
context.
college? Do
Yeah.
you have a trust
Uh-huh.
fund? I mean, are you white? Or, do you have natural privilege? Like there's all kinds of things that can make it so much easier for you to get access to resources that without that context, it puts a lot of people in a bad space.
Yeah, it's interesting. The whole of course, like we have different advantages based on different psychographics, different personality traits, and I think that if we lean into those, I also feel like it's difficult for somebody who is raised as an employee and goes down that route for
Mhm,
10, 20 years to then make the shift to entrepreneurship. I mean, just from what I've observed, they make great clients, by the way, for a marketing agency because
mhm,
they don't know much about marketing, and so they have a full out trust and they don't change things, kind of like a
mhm,
farmer buying a McDonald's franchise is like the perfect franchisee for McDonald's because they're not like, oh, I know how to do this better. Let's change this. Let's change that. Let's sell fried chicken. It's like, you want somebody who can follow instructions. But it's interesting when it comes to personality traits, is having success with entrepreneurship. You talked about Kobe. What about partnerships in the beginning stages? You talked about starting off with the product and testing and seeing it, getting that feedback. But what about
mhm.
starting with a partner to have a kind of synergistic relationship with your skill set, with your personality traits, to have that Kobe quick start along with the follow through, right? So what do you think about that as opposed to testing a product first? Where's your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Just backing up one step. I mean, what's interesting when you think of, because again, I've like all my clients were in the early days, people who were in corporate. So when we think about the definition of an entrepreneur and what kind of business you're in is so important. So you can have people who have deep specialized expertise based on the role they have in corporate, which is really the what of what it is that they're selling. And then they might miss the market fit side.
Yeah.
They might not
Yeah,
understand about
right.
marketing, but if they're selling B2B, right, and their clients are large companies, I work with plenty of people who make multiple millions of dollars a year as a consultant because their reputation, their lived experience, and their market is in alignment with their advice and their
Mm.
experience. Where you have somebody who comes from that background who wants to do a new startup that's completely outside of their area of expertise, that's where I think they're flailing in all areas. So, you can have the most amazing person who knows all about copywriting and market fit and so forth. You put them around a board, table if they haven't had experience talking to senior level folks B2B, and they might feel totally floundering the same way that really
Right.
expert person
Yeah.
feels like they're floundering in marketing, right? So that's the part I think where you have to look at all parts of the equation. And that's why, again, that what you choose to put forth based on your goals that you have as an entrepreneur, we look at one side of really like architects of revolutionary change or VC backed startups. First of all, I just say choose somebody who has a big idea who never intends to be profitable. And then you have like VC
The
backed
VC back
ideas many
startup.
times, like
Yeah.
that's the thing that cracks me up. People can burn hundreds of millions of dollars and never make it a profit and be considered a genius and also be a total asshole as well at the same time. And and yet we can critique people who have like true expertise who make a very healthy profit as not being like real entrepreneurs. So it is kind of humorous sometimes
Mm.
in the space, but I totally see what you're saying. And you have to either be willing to learn if you have that capacity to learn certain things. I love the marketing side of the business. I love the craft side of the business. The part of the equation I don't have joy about is the financial side. So I know that I always need to be partnering with people who do more spreadsheets and analysis and bookkeeping and all of that. The thing about officially partnering with somebody, um, it's a big responsibility. It's like marrying somebody if you go into an actual business partnership, like with a co-founder. So in general, unless people have like a long history of working with people, take a long time to really go through that process, I discourage people from starting to go unless they're just exactly clear that that's what they want. They just want to go in with a partner. They've done lots of vetting and they're willing to go through the challenge of working with a partner, because in some cases it works well. In a lot of other cases, people will hire just team members, flexible consultants, etc., to be filling in the gaps of the experience maybe they don't have. And then as they grow, then they could begin to hire people on full time.
Well, what do you think about hiring somebody where you don't have any experience in that field? And so it's difficult because you don't know if they're ripping you off. You don't know if they're actually an expert because anybody can, it's easy to talk the talk, but it's a whole other thing to be actually walking the walk with what you're saying, right? So if
Yeah.
you don't have any idea in terms of marketing, for example, if you're a structured organizational kind of a person, you need help with the marketing. You don't know what questions to ask to be able to make sure that they are that expert, right? So, but you're saying something interesting, which is to not start with a partner, to start with testing with what the audience wants, start delivering
Mhm.
on that, and then kind of the who not how philosophy, seeing who can help you with what things. The question becomes, how do you know what questions to ask? How do you know who to hire when it comes to making those expansions?
I think you have to ask. You have to ask other friends that you might have who have worked with people. You want to
Oh yeah.
do research. You want to talk to, people who have worked with them. And then I think you want to start with really small projects. So instead of going all in with somebody, you want to test and try,
Ah, interesting.
and kind of see how people operate, because it's just like you said, do people have the expertise and do they follow through in such a way that makes it enjoyable for you to work with them, and do you see results? One of the challenges for those of us that work in strategic areas, and I'd say marketing and business consulting is the same, is people uh, may not realize that it often takes a while in order to begin to see concrete results. You can be the best marketer in the world, and maybe to take somebody from being totally unknown, like I was when I started my coaching business, to somebody who is well known, there's a lot of activity and engagement that needs to happen. So I think that's where some people get caught, which is what I see with clients. On one hand, some just might get very impatient to, in the first month, want to see all the results happening instantly. On the other hand, people can be too nice and they might stay with somebody for a really long time if they're
Mm.
not giving results.
Hey, I hope you're enjoying the podcast, and I want to let you know that I've got a free book that you can get if you want to tap into more of these resources, and you can get that for free at kylesbook.com. Back to the podcast.
I like tests of a reasonable period of time in which you can be starting out and looking at projects. And I think it's really the case for the big picture overall. It just goes back to what we started talking about, of really knowing yourself and knowing why it is that you're in business, and exactly how do you want to operate. The example you gave of something like a franchise could be an example where somebody's like, I don't want to create all the operations. I want something in a box. I know how to manage people. I know how to manage operations. And maybe that's exactly what they want. If you have somebody who goes in like in a tech space and has an app and they're more the visionary founder and they have no technical expertise, that model we see is often you do have a tech partner and you have a visionary. That's a really common thing
Mm,
because it can be pretty hard to execute anything if you don't have that. But in a service business, that's the piece that I've just seen. Me and my dear friend, who's my lawyer, my longtime lawyer, Kyle Durand, have just shared so many stories throughout the years of just nightmares that we have seen of, best friends going into business together, people thinking that they had the best partnership in the world. And so many things can happen that can then make it super challenging unwind partnerships, to figure out who owns IP. And so you have to just be very thoughtful about it. And I find if you don't have any experience, first just knowing what you are capable of the first time you do it, then you may kind of too soon jump into something thinking you need somebody else. I was an example. I never thought I'd be an entrepreneur, never in a million years. I didn't have the background, didn't have the experience. I had no idea that I could do it until I just decided to do consulting as an interim exercise as I was then looking for a full-time job. And then once I got into it, I was like, oh my God, like this is amazing. It's so easy. I'm made for it. I'm really a natural networker. And so that's where I ended up leaning into it. I didn't realize until I tried it that some of the way I was wired and some of my experience was helpful. And then I leaned in for decades now, learning as much as I could to be filling that gap of things that I didn't know before. So
mm.
sometimes you don't know what you're made of until you really get out there and try it.
Oh, that's interesting. There's a deep point there to be made for sure. You say you're a natural networker. Let's go into how that, because I want to go into the next step, which is you've
Mhm.
got let's say you've gotten some market feedback, you kind of have an idea of what you're going to sell or what you are selling already. How do you use networking to really start to grow? The way I think about it is leveraging other people's audiences, forming joint ventures, finding synergistic relationships. How do you
Mhm.
use networking to really start to grow the business? And then what are the actual steps that you take? Tactically speaking, when it comes down to it.
Yeah, so the model I use is from my last book called The Widest Net. So it's a 10-part model that is really based on an ecosystem based approach to growing a business. So you can have,
Mm,
I contrast ecosystem culture with empire culture. So you can have more of an empire culture where you're centering yourself as the core influencer expert. You call usually your audience like your fans and your followers. It tends to be where you're centering yourself as opposed to
right.
centering your clients or your partners. In an ecosystem based model, your client, your ideal client is in the center of the ecosystem, and your
Mm,
job is to identify the best experts in the world that have highly complementary and non competitive skills to what you have. Because I think none of us can totally solve the problem of our clients. My clients every day work with IP attorneys, graphic designers, marketing consultants, virtual assistants, all these other people, in addition to the specific business advising that I do with them. So whether you're, DC or Marvel, like your Justice League, your Avengers, your job is to be creating that circle of people
mm,
who also share an audience. And exactly as you said, very often they have each done their job to be assembling their audience. So if you show up as a guest on their podcast, it's a natural watering hole where, one to many, you connect with them. You can have very specific ways that you might see. For example, in the certification agency side of my business, when we build entire certification programs for our clients, all the assets needed, and every single one of them then needs to have a licensing agreement that certification participants use. So I always have referrals to IP attorneys that I work with that is the next natural handoff for our clients. So in that case, we've really worked out an engagement, and I choose to do it up to this point where there's not like a referral fee or something, a kickback. It's just, I know
mm,
they do an amazing job. It makes it
interesting.
much easier for my clients. And then those IP attorneys I work with are very grateful to get the flow of business, and then they flow it back if
Yes.
they work with somebody who has a need that I have. So that's a concrete way of doing it. So there can be referral processes, doing things like being a guest on a podcast. And in terms of some of the tactics, one of the methods uh, that I've developed through the years is called tiny marketing actions. And that's because it's really based on a lot of the science of habits from Tiny Habits and Atomic
Yeah.
Habits, James
Yeah.
Clear and is it J Fogg? I forget the first,
DJ
BJ
Fogg.
Fogg.
Yeah. Yeah.
So a lot of the science of habit says that we're more likely to get longer term results and we're just doing things in little tiny ways. And when you are building a relationship with somebody who could be a highly complementary peanut butter and jelly partner, right? Highly complementary, non-competitive service,
Yeah.
that takes time. Sometimes people
Right.
just come full
Mm,
on, like, hey, you want to partner with me? And I know I'm always like, I don't even know you sideways. Like, you seem amazing on paper, but it takes us time to actually get to know each other. So that can be in
right.
real life, meeting people at a conference, hanging out, having lunch together, then connecting on LinkedIn or wherever, right? Continuing to have conversations. And then when you get to really know each other better, you can begin to look for real ways to work for each other. So I just say first, there's strategy. How can you identify people who would be good to connect with?
Yes.
And then the second is where you say, what are the kinds of maybe activities or connections that make sense? And then you begin to implement a tiny marketing actions tactics where
Mm.
every day, for just little small ways, you begin to build seeds and connections.
It's interesting, yeah, because what you're talking about with I love the ecosystem model that you're talking about, where the customer is at the middle. Then you can, I picture it like a sun. The customer is the sun, and the
Yes.
orbit, the planets orbiting around the sun, are the
Yes,
different expertise that you're connecting together for the solution that they're looking for, which is
exactly.
a cool model. I love that. When it comes down to the actual the tactics that you use when you're connecting with people, because we can see that the overarching strategy, which is maybe this is the classic Jay Abraham, where it's you're looking at what people are buying before, during, or after your product or service, and
Yep.
those are the strategic viewpoint partnership potentially, right? But then there's also the forming of the relationship, because you talked about people come too hard on it, and it's interesting. I had an individual that I talked with the other day. It was like right away, bam! I so exactly see what you're talking about. Afterwards, it left this like sour taste in my mouth about him, even though he probably had good intentions, but it was just a little bit, it was too forced and it was too fast. And so when it comes to building these relationships out, and you talked about using LinkedIn, yeah, connecting over email, sending maybe cards in the mail. What are some ways that you actually build these relationships out and then build trust? And then what does that transition look like from being forming a relationship without
Mhm.
any strings attached to then offering some sort of a proposed partnership, as opposed to just floating the friendship along, but then never having that pivot happen, because that's important as well. How do you do those two?
Well, I think you discover if there is a potential partnership or not by doing genuine connection. And there can be a difference between just people who are like super fun to hang out with, who you might find or you just love to have in your friend circle. There's plenty of folks like that maybe we don't serve the exact same client. And so I think they're amazing and love to see them at a conference or whatever, chat on social and really enjoy just having them in my social circle versus people who I really am looking for their expertise around the specific way that they help support my clients. And so in that way, the shared conversation is often getting to know each other as people, which to me is really important, getting to know their ethical perspective, paying attention and noticing what
Hmm.
they share, how they share, and then just beginning to find ways to have conversations about things. Commonly, there could be asking somebody to be a guest on the podcast, right? You just did a tiny marketing action, right? Didn't you just reach out to me?
Yeah.
I forget. Were we connected by somebody or did you just
No, no, I
reach out?
reached out to you cold. And
Right? See?
yeah, so, and then I'm using all kinds of technology to be able to do that too at scale, which is so cool because I love it. So that's one of the ways that you can make an introduction. And then a mistake that's easy to make is immediately after a podcast being like, okay, so here's an idea that I have for a partnership. And you're saying that, and I totally agree. You gotta
Yeah.
slow it down, relax a little bit. And so how do you
Yes.
actually form those relationships over time as opposed to really going right out the gate like that? And then how do you know when it's time to make that transition if you do find that there could be a fit there?
Again, I think it depends if you trust the process. There's a certain lens that I know I have in every given year, depending on my strategic focus and my goals, to how it exactly that I am focusing my attention and who it is for new relationships that I'm developing a connection with. And so, for example, I have really dear friends and now emerging partners at Page Two, which is a Toronto-based publishing company. Their co-CEOs, Trina and Jesse, who I've known a long time. I've worked with maybe 15 or so of their authors as a business coach. So it was one of those things where we just kept obviously crossing each other's ecosystems, because they
Right.
would hear about me from their authors, and then I would hear about them from my clients. And so there is that natural way in which we did things like reach out, begin to have conversations with each other, have a Zoom conversation, learn about each other going back and forth, talk about ways we could begin to partner. I did a webinar for them. I've done now a number of webinars for their authors. And then I also will refer clients to them and just notice the way, and they're always treated exceptionally well, whether they do a book with them or not. I can see and hear through my clients when I'm referring work to them that they
Right.
are just exceptional in the way that they're aligned with the approach I have for working with clients. So over time, and it's a very Canadian. Are you Canadian? I
Yeah,
forget. Okay, I
yeah.
get a little accent. Could hear a little Canadian
You could
flavor in
hear the
there.
Canadian accent.
Yeah,
Wow, that's a first. Interesting. All right.
I have about, at any given time, I have 40 to 50% of my clients who are Canadian. So I'm sort of a weirdo for listening for accents.
It's a
I'm
first.
fascinated.
It's a first. Yeah, I've never heard that before, but okay, I'll go with it. I am Canadian, yeah, definitely. But I wish,
So
but I'll tell you straight up that I wish I was American because I well I and this is interesting. I went to
yeah,
my grandma has a house in Florida that I went to every year, and
uh,
I don't know, I feel more at home in the States. So maybe one day, someday I'll make a transition. But right now I'm buying a house in Canada and things are going good here. But
I mean, I don't know why anybody would want to be in our country at this moment, but we're, I just
well,
had a
you
Canadian
can.
house guest, and we were just like, I'm like, do you just look at us and see like all the burning buildings and like fear for us? And she was like, yes, but there's benefits on both sides. And it
There
is,
is, yeah.
I think we do have, overall, there's so many wonderful connections. One of the things that I appreciate about a little bit more the flavor and the pace of what I find, it's a huge generalization, I realize, and probably an unfair one, but in general, I find there's a little bit more of just that slower pace, more relational approach that I have with my Canadian clients,
Interesting. Hmm.
rather than, US, especially if people are deep in startup culture where everything is just like moving as quickly as you possibly can, very transactional
Yes,
kind
that's
of
it.
a
That's the word
culture
for
that
it.
we have.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
So obviously, like you have all kinds of people within both countries that are operating differently, but
Yep.
but it is an example of, going back and looking at the way in which we have been deliberately working with each other. We've really taken our time to figure out the connection we have with each other, if there is a fit, which we've established, I think, in terms of our products and services. Now we're really at a place where we are looking to see what's the right fit for their clients, for example. So we can do certain advising with helping people to design a learning program or experience around their book. We can be advising their authors about the best kind of
Right.
business model that they might have. But because people are doing a significant investment in a book, in the context of that service, we want to be thoughtful to what would be a reasonable way that we could create a service that
Hmm.
would feel like it enhances, eventually allows that author to make more money more efficiently, where it's managed as a continuum of services, but it doesn't end up, for example, doubling the cost of,
Right.
theoretically, and this with books, we actually need these days to spend so much more money than people think if you want to have a successful book,
Yeah.
on marketing. I mean, it's a huge endeavor that most people are not prepared for. So those are examples of where you begin to see, is there a fit? Is there a shared vision about serving a client? Is there an ethos and a values alignment about the way that you operate? And then how can you define the service in the context of understanding the experience of the client? So it's not so much like, hey, we could just do
Yes.
this, let's just throw our services together, but really thinking about it from where is that client at? What's the best starting place? And then begin to create the warm handoffs between
Right.
the relationship. So going back to, there's not a checkpoint of like, okay, have 5 meetings, leave 3 comments on LinkedIn. And I know you weren't saying it in that way, but I
Yeah.
find for a lot of people, it's helpful to have sometimes concrete examples of how you build that relationship. When I say the relationship reveals itself to you, it's
Mm,
often because if you
interesting.
make time to have thoughtful conversations. So doing something like scheduling an hour check-in where you say, let's
Yeah.
deeply look at your goals this year, our goals this year, what's going on with clients. It first just to understand what's happening. And then you notice that there's a lot of cool ideas when you have already gotten to know each other, then that's often the
Mm.
part where there's a launch point. There's other people I've been in relationship with for 10, 15 years who now, just because of where my business is and how it's in alignment with what they're doing, all of a sudden, even though we've been friendly before, now we actually have a reason to work together because and to like share services because what I have is actually fitting like a puzzle piece into what they're doing.
Right, it's one of the planets in their orbit that naturally fits, and so without that planet being there, then there's the gravitational pull is off for the rest of the planets, which is an interesting
Yes.
way of thinking about it, to extend that metaphor. You talk about really getting and keeping in mind the experience that the customer is having, so that way you're not, saying somebody just spent 50 grand on getting a book written. You're not going to say, okay, now spend another 50 grand on marketing the book. How do you think about entering that relationship when you do get a referral, or how do you expect others to manage the relationship when you send a referral, to make sure that the experience is copacetic, that everybody's okay with not getting double charged right off the bat? How do you structure that offer so that they feel that it's fair and they're excited to have you market the book in this example?
Well, it's talking with them, and it totally depends who people are and the resources they have. In a general design of structures of offers within a business, within a service business, I generally like to think of the small, medium, and large. You think about it in terms of a product funnel, where you might have, a little bit lower cost, medium cost, higher cost that is based on allowing somebody to start with you at a lower investment and then also having a way to be working deeper with people. The context for the client is where you do lean in and you figure out what are they trying to accomplish, what are the resources they have, what's the priority of what they want to get done. Some people have the resources to go all in, and it's the perfect decision for them to invest another 50K in our
Yeah.
services. For other people, based on where they are, we can think of what is a small way of 5K kind of kickoff so that we can get them moving in the right direction as maybe they begin to pick up, sell more things, and then ease
Mm.
into the rest of the relationship. So there's a difference when you have more of a formal partnership. I'm a big fan of productized services. That's the way that we definitely structure things within our agency, where you can look for a way, if you have partners where you know that you're really going to be co-marketing, that you specifically look at the context of that client, what exactly do they need, and then you figure out what does make sense for the right fit in terms of just what that offering is, and then
Right.
make it easy for your partner to sell it for you, and vice versa, as opposed to just you coming to me as you're an author and saying, what can you do for me? And I might give you 13 different ways of doing it. And all of a sudden, maybe you've had a very structured experience with your work. Let's say you're a page 2 client. So you've had a very structured experience with them with concrete deliverables. It's going to feel weird to you if you're going to then move into a
Right, there's a
situation where things
jarring
aren't clear.
effect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As opposed to I'm like, tell me about where you're at, ask very
Mm.
specific qualifying questions. And then we can say, okay, I have A, B, and C. It sounds like for what you want to accomplish that maybe we should start with B. And then if we get rolling, then we can easily like move into C. But let's start here,
Right.
based on whatever, kind of the situation that you're in.
What are some of those qualifying questions that you know, so that way you know what to offer them? I mean, like, so that way you can kind of judge and get a gauge of how much their budget is and be able to make an offer accordingly. Do you ask what their budget is? And then how do you know what services to start off with? We can use the book example with K2, but then also keeping in mind that we can use this with any business and any offer. What are some of the questions that you ask to kind of gauge the situation so you know what to start them out with?
Yeah, well, it's in most cases, if you've been in business for a while, you would have a core idea already about what your services are.
Yeah, of course.
Core questions I might ask, a new client, tell me a little bit about your business. Who are your ideal customers? What are what are you selling? What are the kind of offers that you sell? What are your goals this year? Are there any concrete kind of projects or programs that you're preparing for? So in the case that, let's say we're building a certification program for somebody, I might say, what's causing you to be doing this, initiating this project right now? Do you
Mm,
have a specific client who's asking for it? That's a really important question because sometimes people just get
right.
fired up about doing something.
Yeah.
And in the case of a certification, you really need to have a pretty mature market. And usually you have to have many people who are already asking to be certified in your method. It's a much more mature offering.
Yes.
And so if somebody just says, no, I just really find I want to have ways of making money in my sleep and having recurring revenue, then I might back up and say, well, let's maybe look at, tell me a little bit more about, what the starting place is. So at first I like to get a picture of the bigger context of their business. I might ask questions about the size of their audience and the different, what are the regular marketing vehicles that they use, and then get a sense of their average deal size. I might ask them about, their business, kind of, what's the health of their business, what's their annual revenue, things like that. And that's because of the nature of, the services that I'm delivering for business, like holistic business advising or developing programs. And then I'm not afraid ever of asking a specific question. Did you have a number in mind in terms of like what it is that you were thinking of investing in a program like this? If it's a B2B company, then a great question that comes from my past client, Skip Miller, who wrote the book Proactive Selling, is what's the process for making a budget decision like this and who's involved?
Love it.
Because
Yeah.
that way you learn all about, because if you just say, do you have budget making authority? Most people in their ego will say
Oh
yes.
yeah, of course.
And
Yeah. And then then
realize,
I got to talk to the founder one sec. I got to get back to you next week. He's like, I thought
and then the board
we just
has
talked
to,
about this. Yeah, I know, right?
exactly.
It's an interesting problem. Yeah, no kidding. How do you know when it comes to certifying? How do you know when it's a good fit? Let's say you've got a model that's working. Let's say you've got
Mhm.
something that you think would be able to be licensed to others. How do you know when it's a good fit to start to make that pivot to go from doing what you're doing to helping other people do what you've developed and proven works? How do you make that shift? How do you know when it's a good fit, and then how do you do it?
It is usually because either you just get way too full in your practice, and so you
Right.
can't be
Yeah.
delivering it. There's very specific decisions that you make if you sell B2B, if you sell to big companies versus you sell to individuals, because it makes a huge difference strategically. If let's say you have a marketing agency and you have a really specific way that you can, create a marketing plan in a day or an hour, whatever the promise is, and so there's other marketing consultants who are like, wow, I see you totally booked and busy. I want to learn from you. I want to be certified. If you're not careful, you could end up creating competition in your market if you still are choosing to have your own business where you're
Yeah.
delivering it, if you're not
Yeah.
stepping out of doing that. So some people can choose to have a first approach to certification that just expands their capability in their own company to have other people who are doing the work. It works when you tend to need to have a really large audience when you are certifying, let's say, individual consultants or trainers in your method to use with their clients. It means that you've done a really big job of building a pretty gigantic brand that people are excited by. On the B2B side, our best indicator is where their client is asking them if they could do say a train the trainer program. So they say, we love your workshop, we want to bring it out to 2000
Right.
managers,
Mm.
and do you have some kind of a licensing train the trainer program? That's usually when, they can shake their head and say yes, and then they give us a call and they
Yeah,
say,
exactly.
how
That's where my
quickly can
mind
we
went. I'm
get?
like, yeah, of course we do. Let me just figure this out really fast.
Absolutely,
Yeah, I'll
yeah.
take your money. Sure, I'll figure it out afterwards. And I think that's a very entrepreneurial, quick start way of doing things. I love it. I think we covered a lot. This is fascinating. What's a question that I should be asking you that if I were to ask would be able to provide the maximum amount of value to an entrepreneur watching?
Geez, that's a good one. um we did cover a lot of ground. I mean, I think a lot of it goes down just for what I've seen in the space and what I think it means to really develop like a meaningful, sustainable business over time. It is where folks take the time just to do a reflection on really why it is that they want to be in business and
Full
to
circle
be
here. Yeah.
honest with themselves and deliberate about it. I used to say with Escape from Cubicle Nation that hating your job intensely is not a business plan. The fact that you might hate where you work is understandable for some people in a large company, but there are so many different ways to be thinking about how you can use your gifts. I wrote Body of Work as my second book, in many ways as a companion to Escape, because I found after many years of talking about entrepreneurship that people would say things like you can only be creative and cool if you work for yourself, be very dismissive, anti-employee, have all this dogma around working for yourself, while at the same time hiring people to work in their company as their company expanded. So I'm like, so the people who work with you, are they like a bunch of losers that just, have no
Right.
self-determination? There's
Interesting.
so many different ways. What matters is the body of work that you're building. And so
Hmm.
it you can have a different work mode at different times of your life where you can choose to build something, in some cases totally by yourself. In other cases, maybe you could join a really cool small agency where you're not personally responsible for business development, but you get that creative satisfaction of working with a really tight team. Some people want to work in a nonprofit or go to academia. I've seen long-term entrepreneurs that begin to teach, be a professor in a university, and vice versa. So
Hmm.
it is not a magical solution. There are challenges in every single work mode. So one of the best ways you can experiment is just to experiment. See what it's like to have a little tiny project, little tiny side hustle. See what it feels like to build it. Do you get really energized? And if it doesn't work, that is totally okay. There's no shame in trying the path of entrepreneurship and deciding to go back and do something else. That's just a bunch of hype, usually for people who are selling courses about why it is that you should quit your job to start a business.
Right.
So
It's
I
biased.
never
Yeah.
advocated for that in
Yeah.
Escape. My job, my goal with that book is for people who may have thought that starting, your business was the only answer, that once they realize what was involved, they might reconsider. Or that people who might have thought that it was way too complicated, but actually did have a true desire and capability, that they would realize that there was a path that they were willing to undertake.
Mm.
Because I just never have any blanket recommendations that everybody should be an entrepreneur. For some people, it is total misery. So if that's you, you are not broken. You maybe just need to look for a different kind of work mode that's more fitting with the body of work that you want to build for the next couple of years. And then you can change.
Because nothing, yeah, it's nothing's permanent. You're right. And we do have changes throughout our life. I like how you contextualize things. Nothing's black and white with you. As I say, nothing's black and white, which is a black and white statement, which is funny. But you see what I did? You know what I mean? It's almost nothing's black and white with you. Let's say that. You really talk about going into the context with all of the things that you're saying. I noticed that. It's interesting. So I had fun with you. We went through some interesting things. It was a pretty eclectic conversation here. And I appreciate it. Is there anything else you want to add before we kick this off here?
No, I just appreciate the conversation. And if anybody wants to find me, I'm at pamelaslim.com, or LinkedIn tends to be the place I hang out on social, sort of for work related stuff.
Awesome. I love it. So thank you so much for being here. We'll keep in touch, okay?
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that podcast episode. And if you want to get a free copy of my book, go to kylesbook.com and you can get a copy there. I'll talk with you soon.